Are you an iPhone user? Then try searching Every Moment Holy in the App Store. You'll find an app designed to bring well-loved liturgies from Every Moment Holy into the palm of your hand, wherever you go. Every Moment Holy is a book of new liturgies for daily life, and the Every Moment Holy app makes it easier than ever to walk prayerfully through the rhythms of your days. Build your own library of liturgies, save your favorites for later, and quickly share them with your friends for communal use, all from your iPhone. And if you're an Android user, don't despair. We're eager to provide an app for that ecosystem as well, and we're currently exploring ways to fund that development. In the meantime, you can download the Every Moment Holy app in the App Store today. Welcome to the Hutchmoot Podcast, a library of sessions recorded at the Rabbit Room's annual conference, which celebrates art, music, story, and faith in all their many intersections. Today, it is our pleasure to share a session led by Jonathan Rogers and Helena Sorensen called Recovery, Escape, and Consolation, The Gifts of Fantasy, from 2020's Hutchmoot Homebound. J.R.R. Tolkien and G.K. Chesterton both make cases for the necessity of fantasy literature. Here, Jonathan and Helena discuss three of Tolkien's primary arguments. Enjoy.
I'm Jonathan Rogers, and
I'm Helena Sorensen.
And this session is Recovery, Escape, Consolation, The Gifts of Fantasy. So Pete Peterson put us together in hopes, I think, that we would fight
Yes.
about fantasy, because we probably have slightly different tastes in fantasy.
Yes.
Right? You're more interested in sort of high fantasy, and I'm interested in sort of low.
I'll make no comments about that.
But we'll see if we fight or not. I'm not sure this is going to result in too much of a... I'm not sure we disagree as much as Pete hopes we disagree about things. But
Fair enough, yes. We'll see.
So our title comes from Tolkien on fairy stories. Yes. So he ends that essay with these categories of what he thinks, what he says fantasy is especially good for.
Right.
So recovery, escape, consolation.
Yeah.
And that consolation ending with that idea of eucatastrophe that's so often mentioned in, especially in sort of the Rabbit Room world.
Right.
So, but we'll start with recovery.
Okay. Recovery.
What is recovery in Tolkien's terms?
Well, in Tolkien's terms, recovery is a regaining of a clear view of the world. And he values this highly, as I do. I think it aligns so well with spiritual thought and spiritual practice. But he points out several things that it's not. And one of those is a mild criticism of G.K. Chesterton. Because he says Chesterton comes into things and presents a new perspective. So he'll just, walk up to a factory or whatever it is and say, let's look at this from a different angle. And Tolkien kind of dismisses that as being inferior, because the whole end of that is not a recovery of so much a full view or a larger scale view, but just a simple realigning of thought on one tiny thing. And it makes me think of a great sermon illustration compared to a story, which, you can hear something in a sermon illustration and think, I've never heard it that way before. It's really interesting. And you can walk away with a slightly different idea of something. And I think you can even meditate on that for weeks and months. And yet, it doesn't change you and settle down on you and do its work in the same way that stories do, which is why I love Chesterton. And I remember a couple of things Chesterton has said, but Tolkien has shaped me.
Really?
Yes, yeah.
Because that was one part from the Tolkien essay that I just couldn't quite buy. The idea that you have to... So I guess Tolkien's idea was you get your vision changed by this secondary world more completely than looking at the primary world in a different way.
Absolutely, yes.
And that's not something I'm ready to buy. Because I guess I would say I've been shaped more by Chesterton than by Tolkien. And that idea in Chesterton that he went out to discover the world and ended up discovering England. Or went out, how do you put it? Went out to discover new worlds or new lands, and accidentally discovered England instead. And I just find that incredibly helpful. Which is, I mean, and again, I wonder if this is part of the reason why even the fantasy, not just the fantasy you like, but the fantasy you write is very, I mean, the stories the swampy, you know, the swampy fantasy stories that I write. I mean, part of the point is, look how fantastical this world is, you know, where instead of alligators, instead of dragons, it's got alligators, you know. And I almost put a goblin in book too. My wife was like, "Are you sure you need goblins? Because you've got all this other stuff, you know, the swamp, isn't the swamp sufficiently?"
Too far. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But let's see, now I can't remember where I was going with that.
The familiar versus the unfamiliar,
Yeah, right.
and its power to shape you, yeah. I think it's a good question and worthy of consideration. For me, it's more powerful to look at the things that are unseen, right? So the Paul's look not at the things that are seen. And even Jesus telling his disciples, greater things than these you'll do. They'd seen a lot that was, you know, stretching human potential and possibility.
Yeah.
And what was he inviting them into? What was he inviting them to imagine? I think that's a big question, and I think it's something that they should sit with. Really, what's greater than this?
Yeah.
And what does that mean for humanity? Why is all creation groaning as it expands toward the manifestation of the sons of God? Why do we need a larger universe to fully hold the sons of God? I mean, we can do a sermon illustration thing, but I think that stories are such a fundamental language of humanity that's where it's going to affect us most deeply. And I would say, too, that while you talk about stories that cause us to love home, you know, fantasy writers don't dislike the world. We love the world. We love the world, and we love humanity. And so we're always writing a love letter to those things in odd ways, in unexpected ways. But that strangeness of something new and different, I just think it's huge. I think it's so powerful.
Yeah.
And if we take Chesterton's thought about democracy, you know, he discusses this in the Ethics of Elfland. He says, you know, don't discount the voice of the consensus of common man all throughout history.
Yeah,
right? So there's this tendency to think that we've arrived in the last few centuries, and you know, we've grown up as human beings, and we don't need those childish stories like they told, those myths and legends, that we've outgrown them. But if everybody gets a vote, if all humans from all time get a vote, then you can argue that someone like John Steinbeck, marvelous though he is writing in sort of a fad style. That myths and legends and fantasy are where we began, and they will they'll endure what we're doing now. I mean, I put my money on them.
Yeah. So there was something else from that section that is now escaping me that I wanted to talk about. It's the idea that for Tolkien, one of the great uses, and I know you didn't want to use the word use, so forgive me, of fantasy is that it shakes us loose from the idea of possessiveness.
Oh yes, I love this topic.
And so there's a humility. So in the recovery of the vision that we should be, the way what our vision should be, the cleaning of the windows.
Yes.
I think is an image that Tolkien uses. In that we, the way we look at the world, we feel like it's ours, and then maybe we don't see it as given, but rather somehow ours. And so I'm probably using this word the wrong way, but in fantasy there is an other. Is othering that might not be the right word to use.
It's good enough for me.
Yeah, but in sort of unfamiliarizing things, there's a humility in no longer feeling like this world is something that belongs to me.
Yes.
And that corrects our vision.
Yes, an antidote. Yes, okay, I think this is huge because Chesterton talks about something similar when he says that there is always some kind of prohibition in the world of fairyland, and that's very necessary. It doesn't bother him that there's a bizarre prohibition, like you can never say the word chicken or something, or you lose the castle. It doesn't bother him because he thinks the world is so wonderful and magical that, of course, it's so strange that we have any of these things in the first place or have been offered to experience them, that a prohibition isn't a big deal. And So when Tolkien goes into that and he says, we have appropriated the world, we have laid hands on it, locked it away.
Yeah.
And in owning it, now cease to look at it.
Yep.
And I think that fantasy stories, by offering those kind of prohibitions, are a really fantastic antidote to appropriation. And I think this is true in Christianity, because Christianity so often is just reflecting the culture. So there's something very much in Christianity, of my time anyway, and of the last, whatever period, that says, I'm going to take this faith and I'm going to pin its bones to a board and label them, right?
Yeah.
And then I'll walk away confident because I know it. But in doing so, you've stripped everything that made it mysterious and beautiful and alive, right? There's nothing left to see or to know. And so when we see those rules about, you can't do this, you can't do this, I think so many of us jump right to the apple. Well, you can't do the thing. You ruin it all if you do the thing. Yeah. And I think, sure, but this maybe has broader application. It's not just don't do the one sin. It's maybe don't try to hold the whole thing too tightly because it's too big for you.
Yeah, I love it. Should we move on?
Sure.
I don't know. Let's don't move on yet. Everything I know about Thomas Aquinas I got from Joseph Pieper, so I never know if I'm quoting Joseph Pieper or if
I wouldn't know the difference anyway.
Okay, well.
Really, so bring it.
But he talks about this idea of aligning ourselves with reality.
Yes.
And he says, one of them, either Pieper or Aquinas, I don't know, says the great sort of enemy of reality and of our receiving reality is our own self-interest. And so instead of saying, whatever reality is, I'm here for it. Okay. We say, I've got this idea of what I need. Or so my notion of, I start to define reality in terms of what's best for me, right? Which I do think we see very much in contemporary culture. Okay. Right? The idea that, I'm not especially interested in what's really real. I'm interested rather in what's good for me and people like me. And therefore, that's my notion of, I somehow get to define what reality is. Okay. Instead of reality being, that whatever continues to exist, even whether I believe in it or not. Okay. And so that idea that self-interest is the enemy of reality seems really relevant to what Tolkien's saying about recovery and the humility of saying, this isn't mine, right? Right. And I guess Tolkien's point is, in a secondary world, I can get very used to the idea that I am this is not mine.
Absolutely.
And that I'm disinterested in not uninterested but disinterested in that world, and therefore I'm ready to receive reality. And I think that's really, really helpful. My only question is it really is fantasy really necessary for that, right? And again, as much I love Tolkien, but when he starts bad-mouthing Chesterton,
yeah, just too far. Yeah,
yeah, right. And so again, I'm so one of the things that excites me so much about Chesterton is that he does that he sort of puts some distance between me and the world that I do live in, instead of creating a secondary world. Yeah. And I
don't mean to undervalue that. That's certainly one way of receiving, and I'm sure partly personalities or education can influence that. And again, in looking at the whole history of humanity, that may not have been as valuable 1,000 years ago. Yeah, right. For the average person. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that was recovery. I feel like we probably keep talking about recovery for another hour or two.
I love recovery, yes.
I know, it's great. Then escape.
Escape.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Tolkien says escape is, fantasy or fairy stories. Sure. And we're equating fairy stories with fantasy. I guess that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
We'll do another session with the distinctions.
Yeah. But fairy stories are a form of escape, says, which is offensive to people who love fantasy
Yes.
stories. But he says, no, don't be offended, because in every other context in the world, escape is good. In the real world, we
Right.
don't, if you're in jail and you can escape, do it.
Right. Yes.
And any place you need. I mean, the only place, I'm paraphrasing him, but he says, the only place where escape is considered a bad thing is in literary criticism.
Yes.
Everywhere else, escape is great.
Right. Well, the word has been equated with a kind of denial, which I think people, and I think especially people of faith, then are tempted to lump it in with something that's dangerous or bad. Like, oh, this is a denial of what's true. And I'm like, truth and reality then become a really big question there. What is real and what is true?
I'm sorry, what do you mean when you say that?
Well, I mean that we're experiencing something, as you said, something probably shaped by our own self-interests and our own fear and our own ability to receive.
Yeah.
But is that the most true thing? I mean, I don't believe that it is.
Yeah, right.
And so don't mistake this, whatever's going on, the distinctions of our time for truth.
Yeah. No, I think it's really helpful to bear in mind that the idea of something being true enough, because, the things of the world, the hurts and the sorrows and all these things, yes, that's true
Yes,
enough. But it's just not the truest thing, right?
Right.
There are truer things.
Right.
And I do think, fantasy and fairy stories are a great way to get at what's truer than our immediate
Yes.
stuff, right?
And it requires a stretching. I mean, it's one of those things that, for me, sets fantasy above science fiction, because when I read a science fiction story, I feel like it's a stretching of the mind, but that the place doesn't want to be touched. It's sterile there. And I love fantasy and fairy stories because they invite you in. And so for me, it feels like the spiritual practice of reaching into the unseen realm and pulling realities that I cannot see into the seen realm.
So that's when you say that fantasy is a kind of spiritual practice. That's what you mean.
I do. I think we're meant to imagine more. And I think one thing Tolkien talks often about is desire. Right? He says, the thing that I noticed in these stories was that they stirred in me desire. A world with dragons was infinitely more desirable than a world with motor cars. And I was like, why is that true? But it is. It is. I want to be there. And that stirring of desire, which often we have labeled as evil and tried to stamp out, is actually an entryway into imagination, right? And imagination, used rightly, is the beginning of everything. Like, I have to imagine myself applying for a job and having a job before I even step forward into that. And so why can't humanity imagine more? And even in the poorly written, not so great, not going to last fantasy that I've read, I see the writers wrestling with what's possible for humanity. They are wrestling with what it means to be a woman, what it means to be powerful or not, what it means to govern ourselves or not, what tyranny is. They are constantly trying to sort through those things in the way that they feel it offers them the most option to create something new.
Are you still talking about escape, or are you off on another topic?
No, that is not escape. I think imagination, no. No, I'm sorry. Escape to me is denial. Escape in the terms that it's used to describe fantasy. And this is where I get frustrated, because Tolkien says all these gifts, these recovery and escape and consolation, are things far more needed by adults than children. And yet, what I constantly encounter is adults who give fantasy novels to their children and say that I don't need that.
Yeah.
I'm like, but you desperately need it. The more familiar you are with the brutality of the world and with the reality of what we experience, the more you need your imagination freshened, the more you need new vision to enter into something new, because children are still young. They're still, they're so fresh from God that they sense the magic and the wonder, and they sense what's possible. There's no understanding in them of like, I can't or won't, or it's not going to work, or, my kids still think they're going to find pirate gold in the creek down by the lake, And as an adult, I'm like, oh, baby, don't get your hopes up. But that's just evidence of what the world has done to me. Yeah. That's all it is.
Yeah. So, okay, but I don't understand why you aren't willing to accept Tolkien's Tolkien has said he's just embracing the escape thing. I mean, so everybody else says, oh no, fiction is not escapism. Flannery O'Connor says, no, it's not an escape from reality, it's a plunge into reality. And everybody except Tolkien, right, tries to defend their kind of fiction and say, this isn't escapism. And Tolkien says, that's escapism, it's good. I mean, and I think it's kind of cool.
Yeah.
And I appreciate him, doubling down on the idea of escape. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're not willing. You're not willing to take
to admit that it's an escape.
Well, I guess and I completely understand your desire not to let people, call it escapism when they just mean that as a pejorative term, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But it sounds like you're also not willing to accept Tolkien's acceptance of the term.
Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Well, to me, the most interesting thing in that whole section is when he says, "Let's not," my little sheet with my quotations I left at home.
Yeah.
But he says in effect, "Let's not confuse the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter."
Yes.
And so I think when people speak of escapism in literature as bad, they essentially are saying you're deserting. You are, and you used a similar word a minute ago. And I can't remember which word you used, but if our loyalty is to this world, then escape from this world is desertion. But if our loyalty lies elsewhere, then escape might, that's not desertion. That's
Yeah. Well, I think it's safe to be loyal to the seen and the unseen at the same time. To be loyal to what I've seen and experienced, and also to what I believe to be possible or hope can be possible.
Uh-huh.
And when you talk about loving the world, right? You say you left the world and then came back so that you could love the place. You could love England better, right?
Yeah.
Was that an escapism? Did that bear any fruit?
Yeah.
Right?
So it was escapism and it bore fruit? Are we agreeing or disagreeing?
I'm not sure. I don't know. It may be just us nitpicking about the term, but
Yeah.
yeah, or whether we see it as a positive or a negative.
Yeah.
Which I'm.
Well,
it's mostly
it is almost always used as a negative with regard to literature, and so it's hard to say.
Yeah.
It's hard to accept.
Right. It's equated with a waste of time. Mm-hmm. Like just binge watching Netflix, something that's mindless, and I totally disagree with that.
But in Chicken Run, for instance, escape is great.
That should be your choice of examples. Just makes me like you even more. Of course, yes, they should get out.
I was trying to think of some story that was about escape.
They don't have to be part of the pie. They have other options.
Yeah. All right. And then the third category that Tolkien provides us is consolation. You got, and my quotations are completely, as I said,
missing
elsewhere.
Well, mine are on little cards, but this is one of the ones where I think we might, I don't know so much that we'll struggle to agree as that I don't have enough evidence to support my side. I just feel strongly about it. But you talked about consolation, right? This is going to be the turn. This moment in the story where, based on all the evidence, based on everything we've seen, it cannot end well. And yet, it does, surprisingly, beyond all hope. And this is this moment of joy, this moment, he says, there's a catch in the breath, there's a lifting of the heart. And of course, for Tolkien, this happens most easily in fantasy and fairy tales. So my only argument, I know I've read that and had that experience with all kinds of books, memoir, even, it doesn't have to be fiction even. I've had that experience with scripture. I've had that experience in nature and with music. I mean, it's possible to have it all across the board, but
that experience,
the experience of unexpected joy, that it's sort of glimpse into something beyond. But I do love the way Tolkien refers to it as joy beyond the walls of the world. That's that. And so for me to step beyond the walls of the world from the very beginning and then move even further into deeper joy is just that much sweeter. There's another place where he mentions a moment you pass outside the frame, joy that passes outside the frame. And that's what I love, the seen and unseen realms being parallel and happening at the same moment, and your chance to ease into the other. And so I think really starting a story of fantasy or a fairy tale, I think it opens you more, right? He talks about your hoard. What was the description he says? He says, I love this. Creative fantasy may open your hoard and let all the locked things fly away.
Isn't that great?
I do love that. Okay, so to begin a story that Wendell Berry writes, or that John Steinbeck, or whoever, Flannery O'Connor, I'm going to begin with everything locked up, right? Because this is a world that I've appropriated. I know my world. I know these people. I'm very familiar with this. And so I think that it takes maybe even more skill for them to unlock the hoard because you're so comfortable in that world. And to find that turn and that joy, how do you expect to win the lottery? No, because you know this world, right? It's probably not going to happen. But in a fantasy story, when I've already moved into the realm of what I can't control and what I don't know and what feels so other and so grand and so too big for me to put my hands on, I think the joy is just even better, even more likely for the hoard to be unlocked, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love those. I love those stories too.
Sure.
I just, again, when reading this essay from Tolkien, I can't. Everything he says about eucatastrophe and the idea of, the consolation of the happy ending, right? I mean, he's just talking about comedy. He's not talking or comedy in the literary sense, or divine comedy. And the gospel, right, which is a comic vision of the world, a vision of the world that says, I know you thought you were living in a tragedy, but you're really living in a comedy,
right?
Whereas as it turns out, the suffering is temporary, and all the death there ever was sat next to life would scarcely fill a cup, right? I mean, that's the eucatastrophe. That's the gospel, and Tolkien's claim that fairy stories are uniquely capable of communicating. I appreciate what you say about removing us from the frame. I guess my question is the idea of the unseen existing alongside the seen. Yes, I'm willing to accept your idea and Tolkien's idea that fantasy is better at that, makes more naturally suited to that than just regular
any old story
comedy.
Yeah.
So I guess we're not disagreeing after all. Pete's going to be so disappointed.
He'll recover.
All right. As we're probably about time to bring this thing in for a landing. But you got notes. You got your notes. So what do you got there that's missing?
I think we've covered most of it. You were talking about the eucatastrophe and the turn. I do think it's really wonderful. I think it's wonderful that imagination stretches us into what we long for, right?
Yeah.
The desire and imagination go together. And so that eucatastrophe, which I think is very difficult to hold on to, especially for adults, the idea that it could really all be better than we hoped. And even that thing, that little bit of it that we receive, the better, it's maybe better than that, and actually better than that. So it's like a continual stretching of the muscle of imagination into the fullness of goodness and love and joy, which is, it's hard to maintain that strength. Living in the world.
So how do you bring that back from fairy land to this world where we live?
Well, you don't label it on a board. I know that much. It's just in you. It changes you. It's like, it's this mist that settles down in the interior world and you just breathe it until it's in your cells.
Yeah.
I'm prone to hyperbole, but that's how I kind of think of it, is that it's in me now and I'm different because it is. Yeah. Like there's no 3 steps.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I know one thing we agree on very much about these things is this idea that in the sort of demystifying project of Christianity in the last couple hundred years, which has bought into a sort of modernist / postmodernist demystifying
mindset.
Urge with the 3 steps and the 5 steps. And
Sure.
The fantasy preserves mystery in a way that is exceedingly helpful.
Well, I was thinking too recently, I'm sorry if this is a slight tangent, but how, we talk about yin and yang. And just the idea of associating men with light and truth and associating women with darkness and mystery, and how I take offense at that. But I sort of backpedaled a bit and said, why am I offended by this? And would I be offended if we lived in a culture that valued mystery as much as it valued truth? So for me, fantasy novels are a way of being that antidote. That's embrace the mystery of the gospel, embrace the mystery of everything, creation and humanity and God. It's too big for us, but we get to enter in,
Great. It's been really fun.
Yes, it has.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you're wondering what in the world a Hutchmoot is, you are not alone. Let me give you the short version. Hutchmoot is an annual arts conference hosted by the Rabbit Room in which we gather people together around art, music, story, and faith. If you want the long version, check out the website at hutchmoot.com, where all of your questions, or at least some of them, will be answered.